Hello, everybody, and welcome to Facebook Live. I'm Marilee Adams, and our special guest today is Caroline Miller. For almost 3 decades, Caroline, who has a master's in applied positive psychology, has been a pioneer with her groundbreaking work in the areas of goal setting, accomplishment, grit, happiness, and success. She's recognized as one of the world's leading positive psychology experts on grit and goals and how it can be applied to make all of our lives better. She is often quoted in the media with places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, CNN, and she also gave a terrific TEDx talk, and her website is carolinemiller.com. For those of you who want a link to today's Facebook Live, when we send it out, we'll include the link to the TEDx talk and to her website. And I also am happy to say Caroline is a friend and colleague of many years, so it's a special pleasure to welcome her, especially just back from Dubai, and I hope recovered from jet lag. So, Caroline, I have some very ambitious goals for our conversation today. I'd like to include your roots in positive psychology, a little about your own journey in getting grit, some of the principles and practices you write about, and at least one example of a client who has used some of what you've taught her. And if time, I'd also like to explore a little about how my work on learner and judger mindsets relates to getting grit. We will have time for some Q&A at the end. For those of you who want to write down your comments, you could send them to us whenever they occur to you so that you can stay present in our conversation. So Caroline, I know you had a very gritty journey in writing this book, Getting Grit, which I would like to hear for everybody to see, Getting Grit. But you did have a very gritty journey in both the writing and the publishing. So what made you so determined to make this thing happen? Why are you so passionate about grit, and why does it matter to you so much? So let's start there. Yeah,
whoa,
a lot of questions to start with.
Yeah. So I'll start with why does it matter so much, and thank you for having me, Marilee, because it's a real honor to join you, and someone of your stature and esteem in the field of coaching and so many other places. So thank you. And we share a lot of interest in what does it take to optimize ourselves in life. So you and I both come at it in different ways. My focus is goal setting and grit. But the grit portion became particularly interesting to me while I was sitting in the classrooms at the University of Pennsylvania, 2005, 2006, because that's when Angela Duckworth was just starting her research with Marty. So I was getting this master's in applied positive psychology, and this woman was running in and out of the classrooms, didn't know who it was. But my capstone in that year became the book, Creating Your Best Life. And because it was about the science of goal setting, I needed to include this new burgeoning science of grit that she and Marty had come up with, and it was critical to me to include it for one exceptionally important reason, and that was I had a rewind of my life going on while I sat in those classrooms. And what I realized is that grit is not necessarily inborn, and that I had to cultivate it in order to save my own life back in the 1980s when I struggled with bulimia. And that's when I put it all together and realized that this is a quality people need to understand, and understand that you don't have to be born into a special family or be an Olympian in order to have grit. And if I had to cultivate it, then and I did, then anybody can. So I think it's one of the most important qualities any of us can aspire to have for a lot of reasons, but I'll just leave it right there.
Your own personal journey is what makes you so authentic, as well as evidence-based in doing the work you do. But I know you also swim every morning, you have a black belt, you have a really full, thriving practice of coaching and speaking. So grit, it feels to me, is undergirds everything you've accomplished and what's given you what I know personally is a very happy life right now. But I love it when you say, if I can do this, anybody can. That doesn't mean we all have to get black belts.
No, and I like bringing the martial arts in. I included a section on my current martial art. I got a black belt in Hapkido, and now I'm pursuing one in Siwei Kyun, which frankly is a lot harder, particularly at my age. But I like the martial arts analogy because you don't get a black belt overnight, or you shouldn't. There are a lot of belt mills, or what we call McDojos, particularly in the United States. But if you're in the right martial art with the right kind of sensei and dojo, then you're actually working very hard in like a formulaic, gritty approach. You have to be passionate about it. You have to pursue it for not just a short period of time, but at least, a while. There have to be setbacks. There has to be a learning curve that can be steep and feel steep, but you have to go out of your comfort zone on a regular basis. And I come back from a lot of my classes now bruised and but elated that I actually was willing to push myself that hard for something I cared about. And that's an integral part of being gritty, is it has to be your goal, not someone else's goal, your goal. So I love the martial arts as the perfect analogy. And I'm not gritty in everything, nor are the people I studied and wrote about gritty in everything. And that is a really interesting point that I think we should pull out and look at during our chat today.
Yeah, and let's go there for a moment. I think you're saying you're gritty about what you really care about.
Right, exactly. Because everybody I interviewed who had the kind of grit that I find most compelling, and that's something I observed in my coaching clients over the last several decades, and just people I admire, people I have in my life, in my own journey, is that they have a grit that actually awes and inspires other people. So in the process of pursuing their goals, they're not bragging about it. They have humility, which is an incredibly important piece of grit. But in the process of doing what they do and doing it in a certain kind of way, other people end up being awed and inspired. And I think that is the best possible kind of grit, because if you look at the typical definition of grit, which most people know at this point, passion and persistence in pursuit of long-term goals, what it doesn't tease out is that there's good grit and bad grit. And the best kind of grit is the kind that is your authentic goals. You're pursuing it over a long period of time. You bring passion to it. You're going out of your comfort zone in the process of creating your best self, but you're also inspiring other people who really can't help but ask themselves, why not me? What if I did something? What if I dared to take a risk? What if I didn't, color in the lines all the time? And that's what I love about good grit. And so it was really important to me to tease out good grit and bad grit as a piece of it. And then just to address the part, they're not gritty in everything. The right kind of grit, they save their self-regulation and passion for what really, really matters. There's a kind of grit that I call stupid grit, where you're just pursuing everything at all costs. You're just a finisher no matter what. Doesn't matter if someone put the goal in front of you or you picked it. You just have this quality of persistence that doesn't quit, but you can hurt yourself and other people in the process. So there's good grit, there's bad grit.
And you also write about grit for something that is good.
Yes.
That you talk about.
Well, and so when we talk about good, we're often talking about intrinsic goals. So goals that make your life better. They never harm other people. I mean, that's one of the rules here, is if you're pursuing the right kind of goals, you have a meaningful, purposeful life, and it doesn't diminish other people. One of the things I found is that with the bad kinds of grit, selfie grit, stupid grit, faux grit, other people are diminished. Other people are diminished in the presence of this kind of grit. So it's the kind of thing that makes you better, makes the people around you better, and contributes to life being flourishing or just better for other people around you. So,
yeah, and you're building a kind of grit muscle. And you only do that by exercise. So, I have some martial arts background also.
Right.
And what I loved about it, although it was very hard in many years, is there's a continuous going back to basics.
Yeah.
You don't get to an advanced belt unless you go back to basics and you keep practicing them over and over and over and over again.
Right.
So I think it'd be kind of cool to talk about what are the basics of grit. that you keep focusing on over and over and over. And you also use the term somewhere, wise interventions. And so you kind of wrap all that up together.
Gosh, what a great way to lead into that. Just about the martial arts for a moment, it is perfect in so many ways because I just got a brown belt and I was learning something important from a white belt in class on Saturday. So one of the things that's integral to the right kind of grit is humility, that you are on a learning journey. And so if we're going to talk about learner questions and judger questions, learning mindsets are you continue to be curious and humble about what you do and don't know, and you learn from other people. But the fundamentals of authentic grit to me are humility, being willing to be curious and open to other people teaching you things, not always being right, being willing to be curious about what's out there, what don't I know? And if we're going to talk about Carol Dweck's fixed and growth mindset, that's another way to say a growth mindset is you're exploring. We're built to be explorers, quite honestly. So when we shut ourselves down, we're not being curious and we're not being humble. Then there's the persistence. You have to be willing to persist and to delay gratification. So people who don't have the muscle of self-regulation or willpower built, sometimes you have to start there. And this generation of millennials, I'm not going to fault millennials. I'm going to fault our culture, which to me has really taken away some of the hard elite standards across the board. A's for all, easy A's, trophies for all. You name it, driver's license tests that don't include parallel parking, shoes that tie themselves. I could truly go on and on, but you get the gist of this. So you have to begin to learn how to delay gratification. So that's another fundamental. So there's a certain amount of patience too. We are a generation and a culture that doesn't even wait for websites to load more than 3 seconds. So there's this inability to actually do what we call deep work, being willing to sit with discomfort, sit with our thoughts. So those are just some of the fundamentals that I find really essential if we're going to talk about what's good grit and how do you build it. So there was a question that rolled in about how other kinds of ways to cultivate grit. So should I continue to talk about that?
Go ahead.
Okay. So some of the basics are, what I mentioned already: willpower, the ability to delay gratification, patience, the ability to wait for things, to let things unfold, the ability to set your own goals, because part of being gritty is pursuing things that you're passionate about. So it's not that your culture or your family or your teacher or a mentor wants you to do something. It's something that's intrinsic to you. It lights you up. It makes your heart beat a little bit more quickly. I'll give you a great example from Dubai, because you mentioned Dubai. I was in the World Government Summit last week, and I had the incredible honor and privilege to meet a woman named Aza Fahmy. And I didn't know who she was, but everyone else knew who she was, because she's one of the greatest jewelry designers of our time. She's Egyptian, and she gave this great story to a panel on global entrepreneurship for women. And she said that when she was 23 years old, she was given a book, or she saw a book that was written in German. So she couldn't read it, but she saw pictures of jewelry in it. And she said her heart knew that that was her destiny. She said, my heart began to beat a little bit more quickly. And she had been, raised to do other things. Her family, her culture weren't supportive of her being an entrepreneur. And yet she knew she had to go in that direction. She knew. And so she has this factory, and she's brought her daughters into the business. That's the kind of goal that we're talking about. It's your goal. And you know that you will have regrets if you don't take some risks to pursue that kind of goal. So there's an inner knowing, this is my path. You talked about wise interventions too. So part of being successful in your goals is you have to optimize your well-being. And we know this from positive psychology. We know that there's this overwhelmingly slam dunk finding that all success in life is preceded by being happy first. We have to up our well-being. And a wise intervention is something that improves your optimism, improves your hope, improves your well-being, your happiness, your flourishing. And there are a number of validated wise interventions. One is journaling. One is the practice of forgiveness. Another one is altruism. Another one is gratitude. Another one is using your signature strength. So wise interventions means those interventions that you choose to do on a daily basis are perfect for you. You have individualized them so that they work for you. So that's a few of the ingredients of grit. So I can why don't we just take some more questions, or? You can ask me another question.
Well, actually, as you were just speaking, I was thinking how much of wise interventions fall on the learner mindset path, and the ways that we talk to ourselves. That's the question thinking aspect, that we can put ourselves down with judger thinking and feeling and speaking to ourselves. That's where we're critical. It's where we keep ourselves from taking the risks that really would help fulfill us.
Right. That's a great point. That's a great point, because in order to do wise interventions, you have to be willing to learn about yourself as you do them and tailor them. Let's say journaling is something that feels like a great fit for you. You love words, you love to express yourself. So, the question thinking, what if I do this way? What if I blog? What if I write in my journal privately? What if I share my writing, with other people? But how do I use this process of writing, which is a proven intervention, and learn about yourself? We have to be on continuous learning curves. And again, back to humility. You have to have the humility to adjust your approach and learn from it. And those are the people who really tend to get all the goods in life. They remain open, they remain coachable, they remain teachable, they remain hopeful and optimistic, and they're not knocked down by setbacks. And it's like when you watch the Olympics, which are on right now, when the figure skaters fall, and we've had a lot of Americans falling, unfortunately. So I've been watching them and cheering for them, but they're falling. But do you ever notice them staying on the ice? No. They get back up and they keep skating. And that, to me, is at the heart of resilience and grit, is the ability to fall down but get back up, just like a figure skater in the Olympics. Again, not to ding the millennials, but I will say that there has been a general inability to believe that bad things will pass. There's such a sense of immediacy. You have to have instant answers. You have to Google something and get the answer right away. And unfortunately, there's been this kind of epidemic of lawnmower parents, just lawn mowing, troubles away from people. So kids haven't always grown up learning that bad things happen, but that they pass and that you learn from them. And there's a field within positive psychology called post-traumatic growth that's really interesting. And what it finds is that in order to live the highest quality lives, we have to endure trauma. We have to have setbacks. We have to overcome them. That's how you find out who you are. That's how you find out who your friends are. That's how you actually learn that you have what it takes to keep going, and you build what we call authentic self-esteem, not fake self-esteem, not something you get from the law of attraction. You have to begin to believe in yourself only because of what you have endured and overcome by yourself with the support of other people. And what about fear? We're all afraid. I could tell you story after story of being afraid in the martial arts, afraid my books wouldn't sell, afraid that I wouldn't even be a good mother, afraid of all kinds of things. But the problem is that fear is the sticking point for so many people, and it's not enough. It's not enough to keep you down unless you choose that. And I think that's why so many people need accountability partners and coaches, because you have to be able to walk towards the cannons. You have to be able to look at fear and say, that's okay, I'm going to do it anyway. Abby has another question. If you don't mind, I'm just going to...
I think you ought to keep going in case my Comcast has a fit.
Okay. Yeah, so Abby, it's a great question. I think we should distinguish impatience, waiting for a website, versus sitting with discomfort.
That's good, Abby.
But that is, I really did a lot of research for Getting Grit, and patience is on a continuum. And you have to be able to delay gratification and be patient for a variety of things. And it is on a continuum. It can be waiting for a website, but it also has to be for bad feelings to pass. If someone breaks up with you, or if you don't get something you want, you don't get into the college you want, you didn't get the job that you applied for, you have to be willing to sit with that and ask yourself, what can I do to learn from this? And again, back to post-traumatic growth, you have to be able to not just push away sadness. Sadness is very appropriate at times in our life. Grieving is appropriate. Discomfort is appropriate. All of these things are appropriate. The problem is we have rushed in to put Band-Aids on our feelings and fix things too quickly. And that's one of the most interesting fallouts when you look at the research on this self-esteem generation, and comfort animals, and kids believing they can't go to college without a comfort animal. Give them time to adapt to college instead of sending them with a peacock or a turkey or a dog or a cat, which is what we've unfortunately ended up doing in the last 10, 15 years.
I know the peacock thing sounds funny, but it actually did happen.
That's true. That's so true. And there are great questions continuing to roll in. Why don't
you, can you see the questions? You could just keep going.
I can.
Okay.
I can. So, Abby, I'm going to move on. But yes, I mean, there's a lot of research on this. And my book is just chock full of footnotes and evidence on resilience. I mean, you don't become resilient by avoiding stressful, hard things. That's the only way you do become resilient and courageous. And by the way, courage is a really, really important part. And bravery is a really, really important part of grit, because it does involve risk taking. These are not known outcomes, but you're willing to take the risk because you don't want to live with regrets. And so let me see, I've lost the question here. As educators, it's interesting as educators. So I've spoken to schools all over the world, elementary school, middle school, college. What I find is that a lot of kids are really yearning to know what are the standards for being elite. So with this easy A grade inflation, which again has been clearly documented, so many kids are called gifted and talented or get A's that they don't even know what they're good at and not good at. They're just so used to being told they're winners that I don't think it's helping them. I think going back to transparent, hard standards and grading that isn't inflated is actually good for them. It teaches them earlier how to assess performance and effort. And know what is part of being elite. That's just one. I also think it's important to identify role models in classes and talk about who are the role models in history, in science, in all of, when you look at history, one of the things I find is there's always a central figure who stands at the intersection of change, right?
That's right.
And it's always a figure who has this kind of authentic grit, but they were willing to take discomfort. They were willing to be criticized. They were willing to be like whistleblowers. They were willing to be early adopters. And because of that, and because of how they endured the criticism and setbacks, they changed history. In school, we ought to have pictures of these people up. Let's talk about them. When I went to Denmark at Christmas, I love the fact that I flew Norwegian Air from Denmark to Sweden. And on the back of Norwegian Air, they have what's called tall fin people. And so on the tail fin of the plane are pictures of people who are gritty, who've made history. So you see their picture and you see their name. And then also on the plane, on the screens in front of you, they have little biographies going all the time.
Oh, that's fabulous.
Why don't we do more of that? Why don't we call out excellence when we see it and then unpack it? How did you do this? So those are just a few ideas of how schools can begin to integrate some of what I think is important to grit.
Going back to the martial arts analogy before, if somebody passes you in a belt and you're not prepared, you are really, really hurting them because you're setting them up to fight somebody that they could get hurt. And I think that again is a wonderful analogy. It's building, 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 and we're always building our learning, building our wisdom, building our connections. And anybody who says, oh, well, I'm there, I don't have anything else to learn, they're in trouble.
I'm so glad we're bringing the martial arts over and over, because I remember in my very first martial art, Hapkido, I was told as a white belt to walk like a black belt.
Oh, and really?
I know, and I didn't understand it at first, but it was back to this whole idea of act as if. So when I was overcoming my bulimia in my early 20s, I remember I was told to act as if I was in recovery. Act as if you've already figured out how to stop purging. Act as if. And it's one of those interesting things, bring the body, the mind will follow. So the same thing in the martial arts. Act like you are that person already. It's this uncanny way of becoming what you want to become if you begin to adopt the mannerisms and the postures and the attitudes and the mindset. I mean, I'd love to talk a little bit more about mindset, because that is a critical determining piece between being good and being extraordinary. And it's the extraordinary people who cultivate the mindset that allows them to be gritty over time.
So go into that further with the mindset. It's a perfect segue. You made your own.
Well, so again, I mean, so much of the touchstone of, and we talked about this at the beginning, why did I want to study grit? Because I was unpacking my life as I sat at Penn and realized I had had to cultivate grit. I had talent and success. I had the bumper sticker virtues. I had the schools. I had the Harvard. I had the this. I had the that. So I had talent and success, but I didn't have grit. It was bottoming out with my eating disorder at 22, where I said, I have got to figure this out because I'm going to die. People died in the 80s. I don't think people remember that that was a hopeless time where no one got better. And so I had to figure it out. And I remember being in 12-step meetings and looking on the walls and just seeing things like attitude of gratitude, one day at a time. And I learned early that I had to change my mindset. I had to learn how to say things to myself so I would hijack myself when I was tempted to, again, just give into an urge to binge, low self-regulation. So I did observe this in all my interviews with people who fit the definition for authentic grit. And it was fascinating because I would ask them what they thought about when they wanted to quit. And the answers are all over the place. Everyone had an answer. And so what I called it was changing the channel. You have to decide ahead of time, this is what I'm going to think about. And this is what I'm going to do when I want to quit, when it gets emotionally hard or physically hard. And so I found that it was little things like a triathlete I interviewed who said that he always wanted to quit on mile 1 of the bike leg. So he had learned to say to himself, well, Bill at mile 1, he's not allowed to make the decision about quitting, but Bill at mile 6, he can make that decision. So he would kick the can forward. I interviewed Sandy Grimes, who was one of the key people who found Aldrich Ames, one of the biggest spies in American history. And she would tell me that in her head, she would see the dead Russian assets, is what they're called, who had been gunned down because the secrets had been given up by this Aldrich Ames. Whenever she was like, oh, it's 9 years and trying to figure this out, she would see them in her head. So we can all develop ahead of time a channel that we choose to go to in our minds, that we predetermine when I want to quit. That's the song I'm going to hear in my head. That's the picture. That's the slogan. That's the something. That is how winners separate themselves.
Yeah, and if you can picture the choice map, which you can, it's not only about having choices. It's about being at choice. I am a human being who can choose.
That's so important. Yeah.
What do I choose?
You know what? That is so, I'd never even thought about that, Marilee, but you're right. It is about a choice. And that's where, good old self-determination theory, we have to choose to have mastery in our environments over the things that we want to tackle. And what you're saying is we all have choices, but you have to choose to make a choice. You have to choose to go in that direction.
So one of the questions that I teach people is, who do I choose to be in this moment? And it's that question always is a stopper, because there's this moment, then there's this moment, then there's this moment. I do want to make sure that we're also including in here that sometimes we don't choose well and sometimes we fail. And that's where the humility piece comes in, and the acceptance, and okay, I fell, now I'm getting up again. So that we don't get stopped by that.
That's another choice, right? And see, this is where grit includes that quality of passion. This is what's so different from having just being a finisher and persevering, and having this quality of grit. Because when you fail and you've got a goal that's authentically yours and you bring passion to it, you're lit up by a desire to understand this, to do this, to see how far you can take it. That's the quality that allows you to keep getting up. And that's a choice, as you said. Now you've frozen again. So I'm going to just see question here. How can educators balance fostering grit with understanding that we have students overwhelmed by toxic stress and childhood trauma? Right. So a great question. And this is something that came up in Paul Tuff's work on I forget the name of his book all of a sudden, but it's not that grit is not the answer to everything. Talking about grit, dealing with it and saying you need to be gritty, that is not the answer for everyone, because indeed we have a lot of children who've overcome so much adversity to just show up at school that that's not where we want to go. Those kids have grit, but what they can learn, where you can go with them, is the idea of building a vision for their future. Who do you want to become? Hold out the possibility and the hope that they can have bigger dreams. You can also work on the process of just mindfulness. A huge piece of one of these wise interventions that we've seen are very effective is the ability to be mindful. And I know there's a lot of initiatives that have brought mindfulness and meditation and the ability to just stop and not be hijacked by your emotions into the school system. So I think it's appropriate to assess people on a continuum. Where are they? Because there are plenty of kids who are tough enough, and that's not where you want to go with them. You want to go to the other parts of grit, developing passion, having the ability to see a long term, where there are intervals along the way where you can assess how far are you going. Do I need to change my strategy? And then a huge piece that I just love is identifying character strengths. And having people learn, how do I use my top character strengths to help me to be more successful and to overcome adversity and to build bridges with other people. So that's where I start with adults even who've just had to have struggles I've never had to have in my life. And you have to know who you're dealing with and how you're dealing with them.
Caroline, can you hear me?
I can.
Oh, good. I'm back, but I don't guarantee I'm going to stay.
Good old Be Live.
So I have a final question, and then I think you can just take it and any questions that come in. And I'm guessing we have like 5 minutes left.
Okay.
So it's like, in a nutshell, what are the main lessons that you want people to take away to live with that could make a difference in their lives? So I'm just going to let you take it to the completion.
I think the main thing that I want people to take from the whole idea of grit is that your best life is outside of your comfort zone. It's not inside of your comfort zone. And too many of us don't ask ourselves, why not? We ask ourselves, why should I? And so if we could create a default setting where we ask ourselves, why not? And choose to take that risk if it's going to take us towards a desired outcome. Allow yourself to dream. Surround yourself with people who enable you to flourish, but who also bring out the best in you, and who are pursuing their own goals. I think it's incredible. The number one way to change yourself is to change your environment, and that includes changing the people around you. And in basketball, we call it the plus-minus factor. Surround yourself with people who are pursuing hard things and doing it with passion and persistence. And I learned something very, very important in overcoming my eating disorder. I was told you can't keep what you don't give away. And I'm just a big believer that if you have figured out some of these tricks about humility, patience, mindfulness, emotional flourishing, goal setting, turn around and give it to somebody else. Because this is the kind of positivity that can go viral and not just change lives, change families, change communities. And so just remember that it's better to ask yourself, why not, instead of why, and to take that risk. And at the end of the day, turn around and say, what did I do today that was hard? And give yourself props for doing things outside of your comfort zone.
That's beautiful. Thank you. I know this is a conversation we'll continue. And thank all of you when we send out the link. And Caroline's website again is carolinemiller.com. And thank you, Caroline.
Thanks, Marilee. It's always an adventure.
Okay. Yeah, it was. Bye-bye.
Bye.